The Cold War, a period of intense rivalry between the two superpowers post-World War II, the USA and the Soviet Union. We now remember the Cold War as a time where the two powers tried to exert dominance over the other through indirect means, such as proxy wars or space races. Yet there were also times where nuclear war between the two became a real possibility, and the world braced for all-out destruction, if it were to be the case. So how close did the Cold War get to turning nuclear? It is important to first go over why the prospects of a nuclear war were seen as something that should be completely avoided, even more so than conventional warfare, and only seen as a distant, last resort response. Unlike conventional warfare, which could be more precisely carried out through troops and other advanced conventional weapons, nuclear warheads provided a form of attack that was not only widespread, but also completely and utterly destructive, with civilian populations almost certainly being affected if bombs were dropped on cities, as seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Combine this with the fact that both the USA and the USSR had these weapons by 1949, making any nuclear engagement between the two almost certainly one that would result in complete destruction of both sides, regardless of the conventional capabilities of the two, a term that is called mutually assured destruction. As a result, both the USA and the USSR tried to show their might through building up their nuclear stockpiles, as opposed to actually using them and trying to indirectly win against the other through proxy wars, rather than risk direct confrontation. However, despite this shared sentiment between the two powers in many treaties, especially towards the end of the Cold War, during a period called the Détente, where there was a collaborative effort to limit nuclear stockpiles and ease relations, there were still some times that got a little too heated between the two powers and risked an all-out nuclear war. One of the most notable of these was the aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion. Before 1959, Cuba was very closely economically linked to the USA. However, Cuba had a socialist revolution in 1959. The USA refused to deal with this new government, and so Cuba looked for other countries to build economic ties with. And guess which country they decided to choose? Yes, the Soviet Union. Cuba, for example, traded Soviet oil for Cuban sugar, and this growing relationship between the two countries also meant the relationship between the USA and Cuba started to worsen because of the whole Cold War and everything. This mainly stemmed from the USA's firm opposition to communism, and so didn't want to have a socialist government in its sphere of influence. Cuba's leader, Fidel Castro, became a new target for the USA in order to try and weaken and remove this socialist regime. The USA refused to recognize this new government under Castro and tried to assassinate him to no success. As a result, the USA decided upon a US-backed invasion of Cuba in order to overthrow Castro. So in 1941, the USA tried to invade Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion by trying to make it look like a Cuban revolt. However, the planes the USA tried to disguise as Cuban were actually photographed and recognized as US planes, thus showing to the world that the USA had indeed backed the invasion and that it wasn't just some Cuban revolt. The US-backed troops ended up surrendering when they faced 20,000 of Castro's troops. This failed invasion had significant consequences for the USA. Firstly, they weren't able to achieve their main aim of removing the socialist regime in Cuba. Secondly, this had wrecked any chances of improving US-Cuba relations and pushed Cuba further towards the Soviet Union as they started building even closer ties. A result of this relationship was the Soviet Union deciding to transport nuclear warheads to Cuba, as the USA had missiles close to the Soviet Union, for example in the UK, but the Soviet Union had none close to the USA. Therefore, the Soviet Union decided to use this opportunity to fix a key strategic problem for them and also prevent another US invasion of Cuba aimed at removing the communist government. Soon enough, in 1962, US spy planes photographed the Cuban missile sites, and the information that the USA was now within range of Soviet nuclear missiles was out, causing widespread panic. This marked a significant escalation in tensions between the two powers. Following this, Kennedy decided against an attack on Cuba and instead opted for a blockade of the country. However, the Soviet Union argued that the blockade was an act of aggression and that its ships would ignore it. For a short while after this, tensions were sky high as both countries prepared for a nuclear attack and Cuba prepared for a potential invasion. During this period, there was a particular time that highlights just how close the world was to a potential full-scale nuclear war. On October 27, 1962, the USA found an unidentified submarine near Cuba. This was a Soviet submarine called B-59 that was also armed with a nuclear torpedo. In an attempt to identify the submarine, the USA deployed non-lethal depth charges in order to try and force the submarine to surface for identification. However, the submarine was too deep underwater to pick up any radio signals and had not been in contact with their base in Russia for days at this point. Therefore, those on board had no idea whether a full-scale war had broken out or not, and even determined that the depth charges must be an attack on the submarine. Captain Valentin Savitsky believed that hostilities may have begun and even wanted to launch the nuclear T-5 torpedo. On most of the Soviet submarines that were armed with nuclear torpedoes, a launch only needed to be authorized by the captain and a political officer. However, on this particular submarine, a third signature was necessary because a certain man named Vasily Arkhipov was also a chief of staff south of the brigade. Despite the other two authorizing the launch of the missile, Vasily opposed it, and an argument followed. Vasily eventually managed to persuade Savitsky to surface and wait for orders, thus preventing a nuclear attack on the United States that would have almost certainly led to a devastating nuclear conflict. The submarine surfaced, with it nearly being out of battery power and its air conditioning failing among US warships, and was ordered back to the USSR. This particular story shows how close the Cold War got to turning nuclear, as only one more signature was needed for an attack to be launched. The Cuban Missile Crisis as a whole was deemed the most tense part of the whole conflict, and the period that soon followed, called the détente, marked a significant cooling of tensions, as both powers sought to improve relations and prevent another potential escalation. There were a few minor escalations, but overall, none arguably came close to the tension seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis.